Elijah is the next mystic in our series on Western mysticism. Where Moses represented oneness, Elijah represents omnipotence. His revelation showed us the nature of spiritual power. In the twilight of the Israeli kingdom, founded by Kings David and Solomon, a new king, Ahab, sat on the throne. He was one of Israel's great warriors, a brilliant tactician, and his armies had protected the kingdom from the Assyrians and the Babylonians for decades. He had married Jezebel, an educated Phoenician princess and one of the great beauties of her time. She was worldly and cunning, determined to claim as much power for herself and her gods as she could. She had 100 priests and prophets to secure that power and win over a people torn between the glamour and riches of the material world and the laws of Moses. In the middle of these two worlds, the world of material power, of good and evil, and the world of the mystic, where life's bounty and individual safety are an activity of the eye within, stood Elijah. He was the last prophet to maintain the commandments of Moses, and he was hunted by Jezebel and her priests. He preached throughout the land, reminding the people of their legacy: one God, an unseen God that cannot be pictured in the mind, a God whose name is sacred because its name is I. Elijah had been in Jerusalem, warning King Ahab not to let the priests of Baal, the god of the Phoenicians, convince his people that Baal was no different from the God of Abraham. He reminded the king of Moses' first commandment, not to have any God but I. But Ahab was infatuated with Jezebel and all that she represented: her beauty, her pleasure, her cunning, and her sharp mind. The idea that pleasure and a fulfilled life are material, and that they are the antithesis of spiritual living, is the great illusion. Success, happiness, and liberty are spiritual qualities that come into individual expression as activities of the realization of oneness. That is the power the mystic has over the belief of duality, the belief in material cause and effect. King Ahab had Elijah arrested to please Jezebel. As the icon of beauty and intellect, she knew the threat mystical awareness brought to her rule. She knew how tenuous the trappings of success and power were. But there were still those in the land who knew the blessing of the one, that spiritual identity without opposite. They knew the power of God was omnipotent. One of these men was Obadiah, a general in Ahab's army, and he arranged for Elijah to escape from Jezebel's prison. Elijah, like Moses, could hear the voice of God, and that voice told him to go hide in the wilderness. The same wilderness, the same empty and receptive state of consciousness that was the midwife to spiritual revelation. Like Moses, Elijah was in the wilderness without food or shelter. His inner voice guided him to an outcropping of rock where water flowed and he could rest. Ravens brought him food, and every night a lion came to sleep with him, protecting him from danger and keeping him warm throughout the cold nights. After a year in the wilderness, the voice came again and ordered Elijah to go to the coast. The seaport cities of Phoenicia were rich, sophisticated, and vibrant. When Elijah arrived at the town of Zarephath, his hair and beard had not been cut for a year. His clothes were animal skins, and though he was not old, he was in his early 30s, he looked ancient. The first person he met was Leah, a young widow who thought he must be a prophet of Jehovah. She pleaded with him to take her out of her miserable life. Her husband had been lost at sea, he was a sailor, her young son was hungry, and she had no family to help her. Her friends suggested she become a prostitute. In her desperation, she was ready to leave this world. Before she could do such a thing, she asked Elijah for food and a blessing. Elijah said that he would bless her if she fed him first. Leah said that she had only enough oil and meal for one small cake, which she was going to use to feed her son and herself, and they were then going to die. Elijah continued that her oil would not run dry and she would not want for meal if she made him a cake first. Leah did what Elijah commanded, and what he said was true. Her oil never ran dry and her meal never diminished. Elijah moved in with Leah and cared for her and her son. People recognized his gifts and sought him out to solve their problems and settle their disputes. Elijah acknowledged the hand of God in all he did, and he was successful. And then it all changed. Leah's son fell ill, and Leah turned against him. "Have you come to tempt me with false hope?" she cried as she wept over her dying son. Elijah asked the Lord why he was not experiencing the harmony and joy promised. Had he not followed his inner voice? Had he not helped the people find peace? How could the evils of this world enter into the lives of those obeying the commandments? Wasn't that the purpose of mystical insight, to rid the world of evil? The voice came back to him and told him to lay on the boy and breathe into his nostrils. Elijah did so, and the boy came back to life. Leah returned to his bed. Elijah again experienced the joy and love of a family. Leah made him a mantle of silk, the color of the sea, and decorated it with silver thread. The town celebrated him again. Elijah enjoyed his fame and the adulation from the people. After all of his suffering in the wilderness, this must be his reward. He thought that this was how the mystic worked. Yet he kept hearing that inner voice, and it was not what he wanted to hear. It kept telling him to leave his life in Zarephath, to leave the people who honored him and the family that loved him, and return to Israel. It told him he must show King Ahab the true power of the God of Abraham, the God of Moses. Elijah did not want to go, but his fame had betrayed him. When a detachment of the Phoenician guard arrived looking for Elijah, the townspeople hid him. When the guard became brutal, Elijah slipped away in the night. This time he went straight to Jerusalem. He entered Ahab's court wearing his fine cloak and was not recognized. Jezebel was there, and Elijah saw his great adversary for the first time. They were like the lodestone, embodying the oneness of humanity, yet polar opposites. Elijah needed to prove whose God was stronger, the God of Abraham or the gods of the Phoenicians. He suggested a contest. Jezebel objected. Did she suspect deep within herself that all her power and influence was based on a false concept? But King Ahab liked the idea. They held the contest on Mount Carmel. The Phoenician priests brought their image of Baal, a goat-headed man with a large penis, and placed him on a stone altar. They tied a bullock to the base of the altar and called on their god to consume the ox. They prayed day and night, chanting and singing and shouting. Nothing happened. Elijah taunted them. Is your God asleep? Perhaps he's deaf. When their time had passed and their God did not consume its offering, it was Elijah's turn. He built an altar out of 12 flat stones, placing them in a square. He dug a trench around the altar and filled it with grain. On top of the grain, he poured buckets of water. He set wood for a fire on top of the stone and placed a quartered ram on the wood. His altar represented the 12 tribes of Israel. The grain was the manna that fed the people in the wilderness, and the water was that which appeared in the dry land. The lamb was their obedience to the word of God that won them their freedom from enslavement to material power. Elijah called on the God of Abraham to prove his power. He called on him to come down from heaven and show the people that he is their Lord and God. With that prayer, the sky opened, and lightning lit the fire and consumed the ram. Bolts of fire turned the water to steam, the grain to ash, the stones to dust. Elijah expected the people to recognize and accept the power that he had called down from heaven, but they ran from him in fear. And then they turned on him, and Elijah had to flee again. The inner voice took Elijah to the peak of Mount Horeb. He was full of questions. He had witnessed the power of God. So had the people, but the people still preferred Baal. Why could he not convince them that living by Moses' revelation led to eternal and abundant life? All Baal could offer was the hope for fertile crops, healthy children, and protection from invading armies, if he was so inclined. Why would they choose that? Elijah would ask the Lord when he appeared. Then a mighty wind came up, so strong that it ripped the rocks from the ground and blew across the mountaintop. Elijah crouched down and expected to hear the voice of God, but the Lord was not there. Then the mountain shook in an earthquake, and again the Lord was not there. After the earthquake, a fire engulfed the dry vegetation around him. Surely the voice of God would come from the fire, as it had to Moses. But the fire burned itself out, and all that was left was silence. In that stillness, Elijah felt the presence of God. The proof of God's existence was in the silence within. That was I. Elijah returned to the people, no longer needing to demonstrate one power over another. He knew how to live in the presence. He knew how to live in the present. He knew that the still small voice was omnipotent, that nothing was more powerful than the silence where God was recognized and realized. He discovered a remnant who had not followed Baal, led by Obadiah, and that remnant wanted to live in the presence of harmony and peace, and they became his followers. He found a willing student in Elisha and taught him about the I and about the stillness, and that they didn't need to fight evil to be safe. They only needed the knowledge of the presence of God within. When his work was done, Elijah ascended into paradise riding a flaming chariot.